He has written 6 best-selling books, including Rebel Ideas, Bounce, and Black Box Thinking, and he has worked with many leading organizations to build a mindset of continuous improvement. He is also a multi-award-winning journalist for The Times and The Sunday Times, and a regular contributor to television and radio. In his previous career, Matthew was the England table tennis #1 for nearly a decade. Good evening, Matthew.
Chris, hi. Great to be with you. Hello, everybody. I've got the chat open, so I'm looking forward, Chris, to chatting to you, but obviously seeing the questions that come. Thank you for, you did call it table tennis, I think I'm right in saying, Chris, in that introduction. And it is amazing how often when people are introducing me at events of this kind, that people call it ping pong, which kind of turns table tennis into a jumped up parlor game, roughly equivalent to tiddlywinks. And, you know, I often come back at that point. We used to get very offended in my old table tennis days when people called it ping pong. Now, believe it or not, ping pong has a bit of cachet as a kind of urban sport in Shoreditch. And there's a new basement club in Holborn. There's also one in New York just off Park Avenue. So we don't mind it so much anymore. But it's great to be. I've just been reading. Obviously, I know all about your think tank. I was just reading some of the history as you were making that introduction. So I'm looking forward to taking your questions, Chris. I want to ask you a few as well, because
Sure.
I think we're in a fascinating stage in the West in terms of capitalism and how effective it is and how we can improve it delivering outcomes for all of us. So I'm keen to probe your excellent mind as well, if that's okay.
Okay, we'll definitely get to that. I'm sure they only call it ping pong to wind you up. I thought it was very well known that table tennis players hate it being called ping pong. Now, right. I'm an avid reader of your Sunday Times columns. It's not Sunday for me without the Sunday Times. And since you took over from Neil Ferguson in the comment section, I've read all your articles. And I'm very interested in, particularly in recent weeks and months, because it seems to me, maybe this is an unfair characterization. A lot of what you've been writing recently has been about things such, well, in what I would call enlightenment values, trying to defend free speech, the idea that there is objective truth. Are you quietly fighting a bit of a culture war? Are you quietly fighting a war against identity politics and postmodernism, that kind of thing? Or is that just projection from me?
Well, I think that postmodernism has been a major defect in universities since the time of its main advocates, and I worry a little that it's started to bleed out into popular culture and popular discourse. I mean, I think the Enlightenment was one stage in the development of our species and an important step forward. But you know, you're probably aware, Chris, that Western, I mean, the rise of the West, I think, is an extremely interesting historical phenomenon. As you know, it has been written about by Adam Smith, who saw the early stirrings of the economic rise of the West, the growth and prosperity. But I do think that there has been a tendency for us to think about it from a very individualistic perspective and to miss some of the differences in the way that one can think about the rise of the West. But I mean, that's a slightly convoluted answer to a very specific and direct question. Yes, I do think postmodernism went too far. I think identity politics has been a massive mistake. And I think that the rise of the West needs to be nurtured if it's going to continue its very positive effect on humanity.
And let's talk a bit about the last year. Obviously, I mean, COVID and lockdowns and so on. It's been a bad time for centrists. It's been a bad time, certainly for experts. And you can kind of see in the course of the last 18 months where populism gets its fuel, because, you know, the experts were really wrong on this. I mean, whatever side of the lockdown debate you stand on, I mean, the experts did do a 180 pretty much back in March. You've written yourself about how they were following a flu plan, influenza plan, quite inappropriately. They had to switch. And yet at the time, people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance seemed to me to be very credible and trustworthy people who seemed to know what they were doing. And I didn't make a lot of sense to me that you would just let everybody get the disease. But I mean, they seemed to know what they were talking about. And again, this is just my opinion, my theory. But we talk a lot about populism, obviously with Brexit and Trump, but other things as well. But in the case of the COVID, people were right in a way not to trust the experts. The experts did get it wrong. The WHO got it wrong, saying it wasn't an airborne disease, that face masks don't work. So all these great authority figures were wrong. And so the skeptics, the populists, call them what you will, kind of right not to trust them. But to kind of paraphrase Chesterton, when people stop believing in experts, they start believing in anything. It's not as if it gave us any more wisdom not to be trusting experts. People just went off and believed absolutely insane theories in many cases about, lockdowns don't make any difference and Bill Gates is behind it and goes down 5G and so on. So I'm not quite sure what my question is, really, other than what do you think is the main thing we can learn? You've written a lot about failure. There's been huge failures of state and failures of expertise over the last 18 months. What's been the biggest one? What can we learn from it?
Well, you mentioned, Chris, in that intro that I'm very interested in performance. And I think the most important performance is that of experts. Almost every judgment made by an expert takes the form of some kind of an empirical prediction. In other words, even people who have decided to come and listen to this tonight have made an empirical prediction that they will gain more from listening to you and I and asking questions and participating than they might from doing some alternative activity. They may be revising that hypothesis as we go on, but almost all human judgment contains some kind of an empirical prediction. I think that the kind of the defining political statement of the age was Michael Gove when he said, we've had enough of experts. And I think the reason is, perhaps I can mention two very seminal experiments in psychology, which pertain to making accurate predictions of various kinds. One was by Philip Tetlock, who you may have heard of, who looked at the track record of experts and found a pattern that the ones who were the most accurate were those who were the least famous. In other words, the ones who were least likely to be on television and in radio studios talking about their expertise. And he realized that the constraint on them making better predictions through time was ego. Scientific method is about revising our hypotheses in the light of falsifying information. In other words, when we get a prediction wrong, we revise our model in the light of what we learn. It's very difficult for high-profile experts to do that because their ego is bound up in their prior assumptions, if that makes sense. So they become extremely adept at ex post or post hoc rationalization, justifying their previous assumptions. And almost all, except for randomized controlled trials, where it's very difficult to self-justify if the randomized controlled trial tells you you're wrong, there's often a little bit of discretionary space over how we interpret what's sometimes called observational data. And the big problem is that because experts don't properly track their predictions through time, they don't revise their models. So Gove was onto something profound, I think, in this space. And for what it's worth, free markets are a good way of filtering out bad predictions, because those business and entrepreneurs who come up with new companies that don't meet the test of the market can't keep self-justifying because they run out of money and they can't convince people to lend them any more. We don't have that in the market for expertise. We don't have a rigorous filtering mechanism in the market for expertise. And Tetlock chronicles this extremely well in two outstanding books, the second of which is called Super Forecasting. There is, however, another very important experiment in the domain of expertise, and it was conducted by Jack. Is this too long an answer, Chris, by the way?
No, this is good. Carry on.
It was conducted by Jack Soll of Duke University, where he took the top 258 economic forecasters in the world and looked at their track record. And as per Tetlock, he found that there was a distribution of expertise, and it was a bell-shaped curve, which is what you'd expect, a Gaussian distribution. And the most accurate forecaster was about 5% more accurate than an average forecaster. So, as I say, this is very similar to Tetlock's finding. But then he took the top 6 forecasters and he put them in a nominal team. And he looked at their collective judgment by taking the average of their forecasts, if that makes sense. And he compared the accuracy of the most accurate forecast with the accuracy of the average of the top 6. Now, intuitively, Chris, if you take a simple activity like running, if you take the time of the fastest runner and you compare that time with the average time of the top 6 runners in a particular race. So, you've got Usain Bolt's time in the Olympic final, and then you compare it with the average of the top 6. What is more accurate, Usain Bolt or the average of the top 6? What's faster, rather? It's got to be Bolt, right?
It's got to be Bolt, yeah.
In a simple activity, the fastest is better than the average. Interestingly, unless it's if there's any pedants, if it's a dead heat, these could conceivably be the same.
Never mind that.
But forecasting is a complex activity where there are an infinite number of potential variables and so on and so forth. And when Sol compared the average of the top 6 with the accuracy of the most accurate forecaster, the accuracy of the top 6 was more, not less accurate, but not 5% or 10% more accurate, 15% more accurate. This is a staggeringly large effect. And the question is, why does it happen? And the reason is diversity. Each forecaster uses a slightly different model. Each of these models contains useful information. And when you combine the information in 6 models, you must have more information than in any one model alone, even the most accurate model. Each of these models also contains errors, biases, and blind spots. But without wanting to get too technical, the technique of averaging means that the errors tend to cancel in aggregate. Some people are higher than the eventual turnout for the oil price or GDP, some are lower. Effectively, you're pooling the information and filtering the error. And my proposition in the book that you mentioned kindly, Chris, Rebel Ideas, is that figuring out how to optimize diverse models to come out with good predictions is an absolutely critical way of improving the performance of institutions, not just when it comes to the accuracy of forecasts, by the way, but better strategic judgment, better innovations. In fact, all of the complex activities in which we've been involved. Governments at present are extremely ineffective at doing this. There are a range of techniques to make it happen in a positive way. But I think that if you combine the insights of Tetlock with the insights, but by the way, Dominic Cummings blogged about this, but sadly didn't know how to make it happen in practice. But if you combine these insights, you will make for much more effective government. It is, for me, the biggest defect, not just in the way that we have handled COVID, but a whole range of different decisions.
Yeah, I was just about to mention Dominic Cummings before you did, because of course that's exactly what he was trying to do. Why do you think he did fail? I mean, was it just simply palace intrigue got him kicked out before he could, or do you think it was a hiding to nothing?
So it takes a great deal of so it's easier said than done, leveraging diversity to make sure that you have an optimal group. And it's also much more difficult than it sounds to revise models in the light of falsifying evidence. My sense is that Cummings knew the theory, but not the practice. I mean, if you think, I know you're into business, Chris. If you think of, imagine a private equity firm trying to figure out whether or not to purchase a company that has been recommended by the deal team. And you have a group of people in the decision-making team with different estimates of what the target firm is worth. How do you integrate that information effectively? And how do you update the models that you have of the world in the light of what you subsequently discover? These are things that private equity companies have to do, or they're filtered out of the market. Think of intelligence agencies trying to connect the dots in different fragments of information to figure out where threats are arising from around the world. And then look at the track record of the CIA, MI6, and other Western agencies. It's appallingly bad, not because they're individually unintelligent, but because they're too homogenous in their worldview, and they haven't figured out how to conduct meetings in a way that effectively harnesses the information in the room. This is often, I mean, there's a lot to go into here, but given you asked the question, I think this is fundamentally important.
It is indeed. And just to stick with COVID just for a minute longer, it does seem, or it has seemed to me, that the man in the street has been more sensible and forward thinking and in fact scientific actually than some of the medics and experts in this instance. I'm not quite sure why that is. Is there something systematically wrong at places like the WHO? I'll give you 2 very brief examples. I remember last February reading about a guy who went into a nightclub in South Korea, and by the end of the night, over 100 people had COVID. because this one guy had gone into the nightclub. And I thought, as somebody who's not a scientist, this is clearly airborne, right? This is not coming around from people shaking hands or touching a doorknob. And yet the WHO, it took them some time, quite some time, best part of a year, I think, to finally say that this is airborne. And actually this washing your hands and singing Raspberry Beret isn't going to make that much of a difference. Second example, the models coming out of Imperial and Warwick at the start of this year, which ultimately really, I think, led to Boris Johnson having the fairly sluggish roadmap that he's introduced. They were predicting up to, certainly at least 1,000 and up to 4,000 deaths from COVID a day in July and August. And everybody, you know, ordinary people on Twitter, what have you, who saw that said, well, hang on, there were only like 10 a day last August when no one was vaccinated. And since then, Imperial and Warwick have both very much downgraded those models. They've said, actually, this isn't going to happen. It's going to be a lot lower. It's going to be quite manageable. What's going on in these? Maybe I'm talking about very specific examples here, and you're trying to give us a broader idea. But why are these mistakes being made at that kind of level?
Well, I particularly followed I particularly followed the early stages of the UK response. So I've read all of the SAGE minutes in those early weeks and months. So I think one can get a very clear sense of what they were thinking and what the reasoning was at each side. I don't know how up to date you are with all of this, because there's sort of a slight delay still, isn't there?
I read them all those early few months. Yeah,
right. So I think it's very clear that the SAGE deliberations were based on a narrow perspective early on. And, you know, for what it's worth, I think this is probably because it was dominated by epidemiological modelers and clinical academics, but not enough people with an expertise in communicable diseases or frontline public health.
Who you would think would be the main people, right? Rather than mathematicians.
But by the way, think about it, Chris. Until recently, throughout most of our history, up until the mid-20th century, but I want to make one quick technical point, because I saw your eyebrows move, and it might have been because of this. I talked about taking averages in predictions. This, you know, the wisdom of the crowds, it's sometimes called. When one is making say you're problem solving, you don't want to take averages then, because two proposed solutions, if you synthesize them, it might be incoherent. This is a problem of, you know, a camel is a horse designed by committee. So when it's problem solving, you don't want to, as it were, take an average, but you still want a diverse team, because people nudge other people towards a better overall solution. And it's the same with creative idea generation and innovation. But until the mid part of the 20th century, most innovation happened through individual thinkers like Newton or Einstein. This is also true of the patent catalogue and so on. A very significant shift has happened in the nature of science, patents, and digital innovation about the mid part of the 20th century, which is, instead of it being done by individuals, it started being done by interdisciplinary teams. Because the problems that we impose categories upon the world. The patent catalogue has a series of codings based on different sort of intellectual categories. As you know, the subjects that we study at university are arbitrarily imposed on the world to help us, as it were, you know, physics and chemistry and biology and computation, psychology and so on. But the world doesn't obey the categories we impose upon it. And the problems that we're increasingly grappling with today extend beyond the categorical boundaries we impose on the world. And this is clearly true of COVID. I mean, obesity is an example, but COVID is an example, where there are issues that arise that might be amenable to a modeler, but it has ramifications based on public health and economics and politics and social science and so on. But if one thinks about it through a medical lens or a modeling lens, you get a series of answers that are inappropriate in its widest context. And I think that's one of the big problems we have today. I mean, you see this in companies all the time, where they get incredibly siloed and therefore aren't able to take advantage. And so if you take the patent catalogue, most of the effective patents now, as it were, transcend individual codes, and almost all digital technology now is recombination of existing ideas. So the great mistake that Google made 2 decades ago was hiring lots of brilliant individuals from specific universities who had been taught in the same way under the same professors, who adopted implicitly or otherwise the same set of heuristics and worldview, and they were incapable of coming out with these path-breaking innovations that are so important. I think this has happened at Sage, and happens in all sorts of other areas.
I'm glad you mentioned obesity there, because that was the next thing I wanted to ask you about. You wrote something in the Sunday Times a couple of months ago, I think, about obesity. And again, I think this touches on Enlightenment values, the Enlightenment value here being free will. And I thought you made a fairly uncontroversial point, really, which was essentially about moral hazard. I'm not sure you actually used the term moral hazard, but that was what it was about. You were saying that if we have a cure for a disease, then people are less likely to try and avoid the disease. Specifically, you were talking about obesity, and was it gastric bands or a pill, or like I forget the actual treatment. But anyway, the point was that there is a risk here that by essentially removing some of the costs of developing obesity, people are going to be less likely to make the sacrifices that undoubtedly are required in order to avoid being obese. Now, I tweeted this thinking it was a very good article. I like the way that you moved from some kind of classical philosophical concepts to a modern day example, and I got a lot of abuse for it. So I assume you got a huge amount more from people who were saying that essentially obesity is out of people's control, that you were fat shaming, that you were blaming people for being obese, and that it's basically all genetic and you shouldn't be so mean to people. How do you respond? Or how did you respond?
Well, look, but thank you for tweeting that, by the way. That was terrific, and I did get hammered on it. Well, I was actually thinking moral hazard is definitely a part of it, Chris, and you're absolutely right to identify. But it's also worth taking a step back, because we talked at the beginning about sort of I think I threw into an answer on an unrelated question actually about the rise of the West. One of the reasons for this, I don't know if you would agree with this, but so my father is from India. He grew up in the Indian Raj, moved to Pakistan after partition, came to England to study law, met my mother. And she's a Welsh from a farming community in North Wales, red-headed. The family were massively against them getting married. They said, your children will be mixed race. How can you perpetrate that on them? Thankfully for me and my two siblings, they got married anyway, and they're still happily married. Well, quite happily married all these years later. But it's interesting that because my mother is from a born-again evangelical Protestant background, my father grew up as a Shia Muslim. And there is a very different way of thinking about the world. There's a very big cultural divide that I was very conscious of growing up. And it's to do with, this is quite a convoluted answer, but I'm going to get to the point. It's to do with kinship, Chris. Kinship. In India and Pakistan and earlier in my father's ancestry in Persia, he's descended from the Prophet Muhammad. And the name Syed, S-Y-E-D, effectively, in many non-Western societies, extended kin groups are the basic locus of life. When we went to Pakistan to visit the family when I was like 11 in Karachi, they turn up with these garlands of flowers. Every evening we met with our cousins I was told that there was a second cousin that had been identified as a potential marriage partner. You keep it in the family, and there's something beautiful about that. Right. And if you think about Africa, Yemen, tribes and clans and, kindreds and lineages, these are absolutely fundamental to the way people think of the world. Now, in the West, in Britain, for example, because of the Western Church, which became the Roman Catholic Church, banned cousin marriage and a range of other types of, it meant that you were forced to marry outside the family. And effectively, it meant that, and you had to marry someone from another tribe. And so people who were born to a mother and father from two different tribes were really members of no tribe at all, because they didn't have that tribal solidarity. And this dissolved the tribes during the High Middle Ages. And I think this was massively significant in setting the stage for the Protestant Reformation, where instead of, as it were, being enmeshed in these very intensive kin institutions, people became individualistic. The monogamous nuclear family became the dominant construct in the West, and people started to develop a personal relationship with God. And so Luther talked about the sola scriptura, where people were supposed to read the scriptures for themselves this developed an incredibly powerful sense of self-reliance, the kind of eulogizing of self-control, of taking personal responsibility, of developing a set of individual attributes. If you ask somebody in the West, who are you? People will say, well, I work for the Institute for Economic Affairs, or I'm a ping pong player. If you ask people from Pakistan, they'll say, I'm Abbas's son, or I'm Fatima's husband. They talk about it in relational terms. And I think that was a really big innovation in the West, and a very profoundly positive one, if I may put it that way. And I was trying to lay out that when we think about obesity exclusively through things like drugs and medication and gastric bans, and we take out the will altogether, we're going against a very long and successful tradition. And I worry a great deal about that. And it's not just in the debate on, this is a very long answer, it's not just in the debate on obesity, but I think in all sorts of other areas, we're losing our sense of the importance of personal responsibility. It's not the only thing that matters, but this is against a deep organic cultural process that has been going on for centuries. And I think it's very dangerous.
I agree. Have you read a book called The Weirdest People in the World? Came out last year.
Well, funnily enough, Chris, I mentioned I got Joe Henrik I've been following for many years, and I got an early copy from Joe, and we're very friendly. And I read a very early version of that and offered feedback, and I think it's a very significant book. And I'd recommend everybody read it.
I should explain to the viewers, the reason I'm bringing it up is it's very much saying what Matthew's just been talking about there. It's a lot about cousin marriage and the breakdown of that, changing everything and leading to individualism and Protestantism and so on.
Exactly. And so, I mean, so the key moment for Henrik, as you rightly point out, was Augustine of Canterbury coming to Anglo-Saxon Kent, converting Ethelbert to Christianity, and then this massive cascading effect, which changed the network. I mean, to go back to the discussion about diversity, if you think about it, in the Islamic world in 1200, it was more scientifically literate, more economically developed, higher levels of urbanization. But the urban centers of the Islamic world were segmentary, as different kins living side by side in these big administrative centers. In the West, the network structure was changing. People were meeting strangers. They were marrying strangers. They were forming voluntary associations. Urbanization started to grow rapidly. By 1500, all the major centers of the world, or 17 out of 20, were in Western Europe. And that created a network structure within the West, which was far more connected between strangers with different ideas, different concepts. It's why the printing press was such a boon to the West, but was hardly used in China and the Islamic world until much, much later. And there was at the same time a big change and a big divide in psychology, which Henrik goes into in some detail.
But at the heart of that kind of individualistic culture, that Protestant culture, is the idea of free will, pretty much absolute free will. And it does seem to me, in the case of obesity, it's taken me a while to come around to this way of thinking, but people who know a lot more about it than I do have persuaded me that genetics is by far the biggest contributor to obesity. And then, to put it simply, there are a certain number of people who are always going to be obese, and all it takes is for them to have enough money to become obese. And so over time, we've had for over 100 years just this steady, right? We haven't actually had a sudden surge in obesity. What we've actually seen is a very steady rise in body mass, which in about 1980 started tipping over the wholly arbitrary body mass index figure of 30 that you need to be obese. And you can say the same thing about all sorts of other issues. And I'm by no means a social determinist, but they talk about the social determinants of health. It's undoubtedly true that income, for example, is a huge determinant as such. That doesn't mean you haven't got free will. It doesn't mean you have to start smoking. It doesn't mean you have to become obese. It just makes it more likely. So I'm kind of in the middle on this. But is it possible, particularly with genetics and more understanding of genetics, that in the same way that kind of science killed God, science will kill off free will?
Well, so the way the medics who trolled you and I after that column characterized it is they like to think of freedom as that part of the variation that's left over after looking at these social effects. And I think if I remember rightly, 15 to 20% of the variation was explained by different individual choices rather than the social deterministic causal factors, which is fine. But the thing, Chris, you mentioned moral hazard earlier. I think one of the key insights of Henrik in that book, I don't know if you'd agree with this, is that the way we interpret incentives is through a deeper mesh of social norms. In other words, how can I put that a bit better? If you take free markets, for example, I think an error in think. I'd be fascinated in your view on this. I think one of the errors or maybe not many people these days, but certainly when I was at university, one of the errors of thinking about free markets is that free exchange will inevitably lead to a good outcome because all of the transactions are positive sum. In other words, if I buy a Dyson vacuum cleaner, I'm making the calculation that the money I spend on it is worth less to me than the vacuum cleaner I get in exchange, and therefore it's welfare enhancing, which is true. But if you take Henrik's argument about, say, southern Italy, which was outside the Carolingian Empire and didn't get the early dosage of these Western marriage laws, you have all of these self-interested people living in the southern Italy, where the clan is still very important. The extended family is important. Self-interest is about doing what's best for me, but there's very little trust between people in different clans, different extended kin groups. And therefore, if you like to put it in straightforward economic terms, the transaction costs are high because you need very heavy levels of third-party monitoring in order to ensure that deals between two parties are properly honored. And as you know, Chris, no society can work on third-party monitoring alone. You need to have one of the biggest correlations with high levels of economic growth is social trust, what Henrik calls impersonal prosociality. And the reason is when people trust each other, when there's a social norm around believing what other people's word is, up to a point, it's massively conducive to economic growth. It enables markets to work more effectively. And one of the problems, I think, with the way that the doctors were thinking about medicine is assuming that the variation that they see today in terms of outcome is some kind of an abstract without thinking about the social norms. And I think what you and I might say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is when there is a social norm of high personal responsibility, it starts to eat a larger slice of the variation.
Right. And obviously you get less of that norm if you start saying that this is out of people's control and it's all the fault of the food industry or your genes.
And you can see this cross-culturally. I mean, it's worth saying that even I mentioned earlier that randomized controlled trials, there's no real scope to interpret the data because you have a control group. And if the control group and the treatment group are large enough, you filter out the confounding variables. But remember, almost all psychological experiments take place on Western subjects. That might tell you very little about what's happening in non-weird groups. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. If, for example, there are high levels of conformity in Western undergraduates, that doesn't mean that. Or let's take another example. Say, for example, we find a connection between wearing school uniform in Leeds and better outcomes in terms of punctuality at school. That won't necessarily translate to, rural Kenya. That may have a completely different set of outcomes, and that is determined a lot by social norms. So we don't think anything like enough of the thing that exactly what you just said is that when we encourage people to take personal responsibility, there can be massive payoffs that change the way we think about everything from diet to COVID to free markets and more.
Yes, and it's an issue of unintended consequences in a sense.
Right.
You're trying to change one aspect of the picture, assuming that everything else is going to stay constant because that's what you're used to. Right. And of course, things don't. As you say, they're absolutely responsive to the general environment and the norms. I think we'll go to Q&A shortly. We haven't got that many questions, and a lot of them about table tennis, which is fine. But I know you wanted to ask me something about capitalism. Sorry.
I don't mind taking table tennis questions, but
we'll get to
you though, Chris.
But before we do, you said you wanted to ask me about capitalism. I want to ask you a bit about capitalism as well. I'm going to quote something from a recent article of yours in the Sunday Times saying, these are not free markets. They are rigged markets. You're talking about, I think, generally about markets in countries like the UK. They are rigged markets. This is not capitalism. It is a betrayal of capitalism. Incumbents are effectively gaming the system, assisted by an exploding number of lobbyists, and in cahoots with compliant Western politicians who move from government to boardroom, a revolving door of legalized corruption. Now, this rings a bell with me. You know, we're a free market think tank at the IEA. We're not we're not in favor of the status quo. We're not a conservative think tank or even a capitalist think tank as such. We believe in free markets, and we're more aware than anybody else that free markets do not exist. But the closer you get to them, the better things get, which is a bit different.
So you would draw, when I say capitalism, I'm thinking of free markets, but you would draw a distinction between those terms?
I would a bit, yes. I'm happy to use them as more or less interchangeable. But I mean, there is, as you point out in this article, there is crony capitalism. Capitalism should involve free markets, but in practice it doesn't, you know. So I think your points are absolutely well made. We've had this story about David Cameron this week. I must admit, I can't get too agitated about him sending a text and going for a drink myself, but I suppose you could argue it's part of a broader problem. Public choice theory in economics is all about this. It's all about lobbying, but lobbying alone doesn't explain it. You know, lobbying is one part of the picture, but politicians get lobbied by everybody. It doesn't explain why they go along with the lobbying from a particular perspective. There's more to it than that. It's about their relationship with the electorate and other things. So what kind of, give me some examples of markets that are broken in the way that you're describing there, and what needs to be done about them?
Well, look, thank you. So I'm interested in probing your view on this too, because I know that you've thought about it a lot at the IEA. So my sense is that capitalism's greatest strength is bankruptcy. That when companies go, free markets are basically a variation and selection mechanism. You have different offerings in the market. Every entrepreneur thinks their offering is the best. Some of them are defied by consumers. They don't work as well as they had hoped, and therefore they go under. And there is, if you like, a selective filtering of bad ideas in the same way that you see in biological evolution. And that's how you get increasing innovation. Innovation is fundamentally related to bankruptcy. And what struck me about reading a few books on the performance of capitalism over recent decades has been the decline in bankruptcy amongst large incumbent businesses. So in the main stock indices, the incumbents are staying longer and longer. In the European Union, I think I'm right in saying that there was an interesting stat from Matt Ridley in his most recent book about innovation, that almost none of the biggest companies, was it the biggest 50 or biggest 100, was created in the last 40 years, that the number of entrepreneurs in America under the age of 25 is at a historic low. And there's a range of other indicators of this kind. So the question is why? And I think that a credible argument is that if a politician is looking for a job after exiting politics, the safest bet is to work with an existing company. The companies that don't currently exist, but could conceivably exist in the future, by definition, are not there to create a quid pro quo. Capitalism, it's a big mistake to think that the CBI speaks for business. The CBI speaks for its subscribers, the people who are paying them at present. In other words, incumbents. What incumbents don't want are new entrants. New entrants are the biggest threat to their share value and the biggest boon to the consumer who benefits from innovation and change and dynamism. And it seems to me that capitalism is going wrong, because the amount of times I've heard the Institute of Directors invited on, when they speak for incumbency. That is, business is what we should be looking at, are those businesses that could exist in the future who need to have who need a regulatory regime that encourage new entry into markets. And at the moment, I worry a lot about regulatory capture. There's a number of books on this, but also the capture of the political classes. And therefore, the revolving door is much more down. If prime ministers, I'd have no problem if prime ministers could have existing relationships whilst they're in number 10 with big business, because there would be a filtering mechanism. Their members of parliament would exit them from their role to get somebody into power who wasn't beholden to big business. When it's a revolving door, the Prime Minister can make all of those deals with Greensill whilst in number 10 and later take advantage of it without any recourse for the electorate to prevent the decisions that were made whilst they held power. So that, for me, is the problem.
Yeah, and I think it was actually the CBI that Gove was referring to in that much kind of misquoted line about had enough of experts. It's quite a selective quotation. I think he said people have had enough of experts from people like the CBI.
Who keep getting things wrong. That's right.
But yes, but let's just dig a little bit deeper into that. So I agree with you that the problem is that big industry, big corporations want to raise barriers to entry. Right. But how do they do that? They do that through encouraging the government to regulate more.
Right.
Yeah. So isn't the answer here deregulation?
Well, yes. I mean, deregulation in the sense of trying to remove barriers to entry, but one would still want certain types of regulation, third-party protection.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not saying no regulation, but less regulation.
Yeah, exactly. So what you want is good regulation. There is good and bad regulation. Good regulation facilitates entry into markets whilst ensuring that the negative externalities are filtered out. You want regulation to prevent cartels. You want regulation to prevent monopoly. You also, I also think that there are certain, interested to hear your view, but I think there are certain social norms that we want businesses. I think perhaps I need to think this through a bit more, but I suspect that there are certain social norms in the way businesses behave that are also conducive to higher levels of overall welfare. But yes, I agree with you. We want less regulation when it comes to barriers to entry. Absolutely.
Right. Let's go to the Q&A here. I haven't been able to read through all these. Shall we have some table tennis ones first? Let's get these out of the way. Right. So if there was something you could have done differently in your table tennis career, what would it have been and why? And I'll add in another table tennis question here. Who are Mr. Syed's 3 top table tennis heroes? And then 3 top authors. Okay, this is spiraling out of control, these questions. But okay, there you go. There's some questions about table tennis and authors.
So Chris, you might be interested. I was a defender. So I went a long way from the table and used slice. And my biggest regret as a table tennis player is I didn't develop a more potent forehand topspin. I should have focused on that more, and that was a mistake. And by the anonymous attendee, transaction costs with certain South Italian families are high. Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. In terms of my top 3 table tennis heroes, I'd go Jan Ove Waldner, Swedish player, Olympic champion 92, and I think the best player of all time. Chen Xinhua, who is probably the best defensive player of all time. And then maybe I'd go for Desmond Douglas, who was one of my predecessors as England #1. And the reason I'd put him in there is he was such an incredibly nice person who helped me a lot when I was coming through.
Cool, great. Okay, the top-rated question is: where do you disagree with Peterson? Now, I'm assuming Peterson is not some Swedish intellectual. Jordan Peterson.
That's Jens Peterson, the Swedish table tennis thing.
The table tennis player. This must be Jordan Peterson. I guess this goes back to me mentioning the culture wars and identity politics earlier on. You're clearly being bracketed in with Jordan Peterson here. Do you take that as a compliment or not? And the question is, where do you disagree with him?
Well, okay, so I have to confess that I did read a book, 12 Rules for Life, and I know he's very popular. I have to confess that it certainly made less of an impact on the way I think about the world than Henrik or Francis Fukuyama or other writers of that ilk. So I don't precisely know where I did. What is it? Go on, you probably know Peterson's work better than I. What is his major thesis?
I think you have to watch his YouTube videos rather than read his books. I was very underwhelmed by that book. I didn't come close to finishing it. I mean, there's one part of his work which is basically self-help, which of course you're involved in that kind of thing as well, but particularly self-help for young men seems to be. And then there's his YouTube stuff. Obviously, he stood up for this free speech thing about being forced to refer to trans people by their pronouns. That was a kind of red line for him, and that's what made him a global star. And then he took Kathy Newman to pieces on Channel 4 News. He's a very quick thinker, very clever guy. But yeah, he is sort of the anti-woke. He's I mean, he's basically a liberal, actually, but things have shifted so far to the left in North America recently that now he's some kind of arch conservative, if not on the far right. But I guess people like him because he does stand up for free speech. He stands up for there being demonstrable truth, which actually brings me to the next question, which is quite handy. And I was going to ask you about this as well. I think this is this column you wrote involving Meghan Markle, although she wasn't the main target, as it were. But it was about how Meghan, in the interview with Oprah, talked about her truth. I mean, she's not the first person to do this, but you pointed out that either something is true or not. To put it bluntly, there is an evidential truth, and there is people's own anecdotes and perceptions, I guess. The question here from Peter Lloyd is, do you think that the success of lived experience truth relies on an absence of responsibility and accountability for the evidential truth that you point to in both cases? So there's a quote I haven't read out there. I can read it out if it helps with the question. Or well,
No,
what else might it be?
Yeah, no, I can see that from Pete. Thanks, Peter. So I think, I mean, obviously, it's not a bad thing to listen to how people feel. You know, if my daughter says I didn't enjoy playing, I mean, I played tennis this afternoon with my two children. If my daughter said that I didn't enjoy that very much, that's useful to know as a parent, and you know. But the problem is when it's the empirical issues, like Meghan Markle said something like, "I haven't seen my sibling in 18 years." Now, if it turns out that she has seen her sibling lots of times over the last 18 years, that's an empirical matter that isn't really changed by whether you feel you have or haven't seen your sibling. And I have noticed on television occasionally and on Twitter, you will have seen this too, Chris, that people occasionally say, if you feel it strongly enough, we have to take that into account. Well, what you really ought to say there is your belief is misplaced, your feelings are misplaced. It's actually the case that you've seen this person lots of times, or that such and such is the case, and therefore it might be worth adapting your feelings in the light of the empirical substance. And so in answer to Peter's question, I think it can be a way of evading responsibility for understanding as much as we can about the facts before coming to an opinion based on feelings. And I think that's a massively damaging thing. And it's, I think, and to a certain extent, the virus of postmodernism reasserting itself in popular discourse. And it's a disaster.
I was going to say that. I mean, this is probably a point that Peterson would make, but more eloquently, I'm sure. But once you decide that free speech isn't for everybody, and it can be denied to certain people who have views that are unacceptable, and once you decide that the truth cannot be decided through facts, and evidence, then what's left? I mean, what Peterson would say was basically power. That's the only thing that's left. Everything boils down to power, because you cannot debate and argue and prove anything in any other way. So it's just power between one group of people and another. What groups? Well, mainly defined by arbitrary physical characteristics.
Well, that's absolutely right. And one of the joys of science is that, Aristotle, the most celebrated thinker throughout the Middle Ages, in the Islamic and Western worlds, one controlled experiment, maybe an apocryphal one, of dropping two objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, showed that he was wrong. In other words, what science gives you is an opportunity to say, your view, however powerful, however great your reputation, has been shown to be incorrect. That's a wonderfully subversive and liberating thing. And and you're right. If facts don't matter, it comes down to power, and I think it makes our culture more vicious. Instead of it, because you can't really attack someone's lived experience, you just attack them directly, and it's a dreadful. I mean, at least science has a way of resolving disagreement. There is science has an agreed way of resolving disputes, and I don't think you can have that in a postmodern world, which is why the postmodern social media can be a really horrible place to be.
Yeah, it feels weird even having to be discussing this, discussing the idea of whether truth exists.
But don't you think it goes back to this idea, we touched on it with obesity, is that somehow if you're very, very conscious of other people's, it's different. It's maybe Is the obesity thing connected? Maybe not, actually, now I think about it. You're right, Chris. It's an absolute disaster. It's an extraordinary thing that we've got to this point in the 21st century. Very sad.
The next question is from Andrew. I'm not sure if he's teasing us here, but he says, if media pundits are the least accurate experts due to Tetlock's argument on egos, etc., does that mean we should discount Matthew's articles on sport and instead listen to his views on the market, and stop listening to the IEA on the market and instead listen to its views on sport?
I think that's it's an entirely fair point. What Tetlock does sometimes find is that those who are willing to make predictions that can be subsequently challenged. In other words, what occasionally happens is that economic forecasters will make little hedging remarks in their forecasts that give them a fallback position that means that they don't have to adjust. I think look for those experts who make bold, with science too, bold predictions that can be falsified and then hold them accountable for them. And that includes me. By the way, I've got to say, some of my earliest columns in sport were criticism. This is in the sort of 2000, 2001, with criticisms of Sir Alex Ferguson, saying that he was overrated as a football manager. that definitely didn't work out.
How long ago was that?
Oh, that was when I started writing on sport, 99, 2000, 2001.
Oh, the year he won the treble.
So they won the treble 98,
99, I think, wasn't
it? Was it 97, 98, 98, 99?
Maybe 98,
I should
99.
know this. 98, wasn't it? They won in the European Cup of 98, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
So just before you said he was rubbish.
It was 98, 99, I think.
I don't know. Man United fan will tell us in the chat.
They had a wobble. United had a wobble, and I said, Ferguson's lost his touch. It didn't stand the test of time.
Right. Matthew's arguments. I'm quoting a question here from an anonymous attendee. Matthew's arguments about the revolving door are often said, but generally inaccurate. We're talking here about the revolving door of lobbyists and ministers. The issue is that ex-ministers often work with non-listed companies, and it tends to be the privately wealthy entrepreneurs or hedge funds or foreign investors who are seeking changes in the rules, who get closest to politicians via fundraisers, and who are seeking to amend the regulations. UK startups see it as success when they sell their businesses for millions, rightly so, but it stops UK SMEs growing bigger. More of a comment than a question, as they say, but an interesting point nonetheless. What do you make of it? I mean, I think there's a point there. Certainly, these businesses spend a huge amount of money on lobbying, but the number of times they fail when up against some rinky-dink pressure group is quite extraordinary, which I think comes back to what I was saying about public choice theory. Looking at lobbying only tells you half the picture. Why are the politicians responding to a particular type of lobbying? That's I think, the real question.
Do you think there's a more general point to be made, though, that if you take, for example, the question of multinationals gaming the international tax system to minimize the amount they pay corporation tax, would it be fair to say that a politician who was looking for a job after leaving office would be less inclined to crack down on that kind of tax avoidance if they knew that it wasn't considered socially unacceptable to take a job at, for example, Nick Clegg is at Facebook now, than otherwise? So wouldn't you say the financial incentives are far more aligned with market incumbents, the big market incumbents, than with pressure groups that won't be able to pay the politician? What would public choice theory say about that? I'm
not sure that politicians are thinking that far in advance when they're in office. I could well be wrong. Obviously, they're aware a lot of other politicians who have gone off and worked for these businesses. I don't think they're making decisions in advance so they can curry favor with businesses, because the businesses, I think, will have them either way. The really businesses snapping up people who hated them the whole. Tom Watson went to work at Paddy Power, for God's sake.
Did he?
having lobbied against gambling for years and years, or campaigned or whatever, legislated against gambling, he went off to work for Paddy Power. So I don't think what people actually do in office it makes any difference. I think it's what the company thinks a politician could do for them after they've left office, and who their contacts are, and that kind of thing.
Oh, so okay, so I'm interested in that, Chris. What does Tom Watson do for Paddy Power, by the way?
Oh, I don't know. It's one of these jobs, advisor, consultant, or whatever.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting, because I'd have thought that if Tom Watson was a big critic of gambling, his voice would carry a lot of weight subsequently. If, well, maybe not, but if he starts to defend, what was the question, Chris? Apologies.
I can't remember now.
I was coming back on something.
Well, we've only got a couple of minutes. Oh, we've got 4 minutes left. Let's have one quick one from Andy Mayer, who's at the IEA. Very simple question. Do we need an innovation principle? This presumably being as opposed to the precautionary principle.
I think it depends on whether there's a systemic risk. So I think the precautionary principle is a bad thing, because it can prevent innovation. But I think that it does make a certain sense where there are tail risks associated to the potential innovation. So, black swan events that might bring the whole ecosystem crashing down. So you mentioned G.K. Chesterton a bit earlier. You remember Chesterton's fence? If you don't know why it's there, don't take it away, because there might be a very good reason for why it might be there. And I think that is often the case. If there is an organic, if something has emerged through an organic process, it can often be much more dangerous to change it than some kind of an artificial construct. So Taleb has written very, I think, convincingly on this. What do you think, Chris?
I'm not too sure, but I want to ask you one thing myself before we finish. Firstly, somebody has confirmed in the chat that United won the treble in 1999. Let's get that clear. Secondly, I've noticed you've written a bit about snooker as well as everything else over the years. You're a big fan, particularly of Ronnie O'Sullivan. I'm going to be at the Crucible in 2 weeks' time. I'm part of the pilot scheme. I'll be taking my lateral flow test and doing all the rest of it. Washing my hands a great deal, no doubt. Who do you fancy? And just tell us why you love snooker so much.
I do love snooker. We had a 6x3 when I was growing up in our playroom, and I got massively into it. And I one time played Stephen Hendry on a 6x3 and absolutely loved it. Ronnie, I've become good friends with. We WhatsApp each other. I think snooker's it's a hypnotic game, isn't it, Chris? The fact that these people can think 4 or 5 shots ahead and then position the cue ball in such a way as to play the red off the black and then up to the yellow, green, brown, I think it's absolutely beautiful. I don't think it's necessarily the best of all sports, but it is a wonderful part of the sporting firmament, if I can put it that way.
It's not ping pong, but it's a second best. And who do you fancy for the World Championships?
I'd go Ronnie, I think. I mean, he didn't win the last big one, did he? He lost it. Did he lose in the final?
He's lost a lot of finals recently, but he did win the World Championship last year.
Yeah, I think he lost in the final. It might have been to Neil Robertson, who had a slightly interesting kind of old Kevin Keegan style perm.
Yes,
which I noticed a couple of weeks ago. But I think Ronnie, I'll WhatsApp him. I'm name dropping here, but I'll WhatsApp him and say that the IEA is keeping a close interest in his performance at the Crucible in a couple of weeks' time.
Good man. He follows me on Twitter, weirdly. He only follows 152 people, and we've never met or exchanged any words. But for some reason, he follows me.
Does he follow you?
Yeah, I'm followed by him and World Snooker. It's 2 of my proudest things.
Well, you'll love to know he does not follow me.
Yeah, well, he's very fussy about who he follows, Matthew.
He does follow Johnny Geller, who's my literary agent. I mean, and Jeremy Corbyn. But and there we are. Christopher Snow. By the way, that was what I was going to say earlier. You mentioned that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't get any after-dinner speaking engagements. Ed Miliband doesn't. Those who attack capitalism typically don't get those after, or big business, not capitalism. Capitalism we love. People who attack big business don't get the big speaking gigs. It's politicians who are sort of mainly sympathetic who tend to get the £50,000 speeches after retirement.
Well, that's fair enough, isn't it? If you're a business, you're not going to invite somebody who's anti-business and pay them £100,000 to give a speech.
Exactly, but we were talking about the incentives.
Oh, I don't think they're thinking. I honestly don't think they're thinking that far ahead. I think people, when they're in power, they're thinking, I'm going to be prime minister, and that's all they're focused on. And afterwards, they try and make some money.
Yeah, interesting.
I could be wrong. I probably am. I don't know. But thank you very much, Matthew, for joining us. Thank you, everybody at home, for watching. If you're interested in similar events hosted by the IEA, you can find details of them on our website, which is iea.org.uk, and indeed past events and YouTube videos and so on. Later on this month, we'll be hosting the next In Conversation event with Chief Secretary to Treasury and former Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay. Tune in on Monday, the 26th of April at 6 p.m. Same start for that one. And you can also catch my regular show, The Swift Half. The recent one has had a lot of views with Freddie Sayers from Unheard. There'll be another one up in a couple of weeks. So check all that out on YouTube. Enjoy yourself down the beer garden if that's where you're going this evening. But thanks again for watching, and good night.